Welcome to Badass Stories from Byzantium, a podcast where I tell the woe and WTF parts of the Byzantine Empire's history, an underexplored and often overlooked subject in Western popular culture. I am your host, Keith Hernandez, and I hope to gently guide you out of the warm embrace of filicidal mothers and into the boiling hot cauldron of medieval napalm. Come with me across the Empire, where the Nords redden the soil and seas. A bloodthirsty mob forms outside the Studite Monastery, at the southwestern edge of Constantinople, near the Golden Gate. Winding pillars of smoke rise along the horizon to the east, where the great palace has been ransacked. The rabble, armed with daggers, clubs, and whatever else they could get their hands on, knows the deposed Byzantine Emperor Michael V is inside and taunts him from without, though they dare not enter. A kidnapping in the house of God is a great sin, even if the victim is a tyrant. The column of soldiers making their way through the crowd has no problem with that. Bearded, blonde, and blue-eyed, round shields at their backs, and great two-handed axes in their grips. These are men of the north, and Christians though they are, they do not take issue with violence in the presence of God. From the altar inside, the Northmen rip the once regal emperor, now dressed in monk's robes, and begging for forgiveness. Constantine, Michael's uncle and co-conspirator, too is forced from the church, but resigns himself to stoicism. If the new empress sent the Northmen, there is nothing to be done. They wouldn't understand his pleas anyhow, as they are discouraged from learning Greek. The crowd is incensed by the sight of the two ragged men. They want an execution, but the empresses have something less severe, if one could say such a thing, in mind. For half a mile toward the city center, the refugees are marched, all the while enduring threats, insults, and laughter from the rabble, until they are stopped by another group of Northmen. An imperial official in their company shows his orders to the captors, who then force Michael and Constantine to the ground. The deposed emperor recognizes these other Northmen. They were his late uncle, Emperor Michael IV's Varangians, mercenaries who protected the former emperor on campaign and at home. Soldiers Michael V replaced with Pecheneg eunuchs when it was his turn to take the purple. How could he trust men who were so loyal to the last emperor? The most popular among the Varangians, a giant man, now stands before Michael, with an axe in one hand and a hot iron poker in the other. He knows this particular giant. It is Harald Hardrada, from royal blood in the north. The last time Michael had seen Harald, the giant was in chains. The Norsemen's brethren likely freed him when the mob burned half the city down. Michael and Constantine both know what's about to happen, for they have ordered it upon many other men, including their own kin. They won't be killed, unless the mutilation kills them, but they will also never see again. The giant speaks in a harsh foreign tongue before the trembling emperor, but is interrupted by Constantine. "You there! Make the people stand back. Then you will see how bravely I bear my calamity." Harald looks to his translator, a Greek who knows the Norwegian tongue well enough, and motions to his brethren. The Varangians start to tie Constantine to the ground, but he yells out, "Look you! If you see me budge, nail me down." With a few words from the translator, they give him space. The giant then takes his hot poker and gouges out Constantine's eyes one by one. All the while, the deposed emperor lying nearby squeals and tries to squirm from his bonds. Without skipping a beat, the giant is atop the writhing shell of a man. He kicks and screams, but loses his eyes the same as his uncle, albeit with far less dignity. And with that, the deposed Emperor Michael V was sent to a monastery, where he would spend the rest of his days. The giant would not be punished, but instead go on to become King Harald of Norway. Through an attempted invasion, Harald would weaken the Kingdom of England just enough for Norman conquest, and die along with the Viking Age on Stamford Bridge. Now, to be clear, it's not certain that Harald had personally carried out the order to mutilate Michael V, but I wanted to give a taste of the fantastical and self-serving nature of the contemporary and later source material. I will touch more on this point later, but for now it would suffice to say that Harald's later success after his role, whatever it actually was, in mutilating one of the most powerful men in Europe is a testament to just how far he and his North brethren had risen, as the protectors and, when necessary, the destroyers of imperial life. Orders are orders after all. The Varangians would pave the way from foreign mercenaries to Emperor's bodyguard in New Rome, with their ferocity in battle and eagerness for fortune. Their story begins in the late 9th century. It's 882 CE, and the Byzantine Empire is surrounded on all sides by wolves. To the immediate north, the Bulgars have been chipping away at the empire's European territories. The Franks in the west are looking to do the same to its holdings in Italy. In the east and south, the Abbasid Caliphate looks hungrily to Anatolia and plagues the empire in the Mediterranean and Aegean seas with pirates. To the north of the empire's holdings in the Black Sea ride the bloodthirsty Pechenegs. And to the north of that, in the city of Kiev, a new state is forming that will prove to be both a thorn in the empire's side and a source of much-needed manpower. Combine Constantinople's vulnerable position with almost 300 years of territorial and population decline. It's hard to imagine any scenario where it comes out on top, let alone survives. But the fate of the waning Roman Empire is far from decided. The Macedonians have just begun their dynasty. They have 80,000 to 120,000 feudal levies hungry for reconquest, and the funds to bolster their ranks with the best mercenaries from across Europe, Asia, and Africa, who are hungry for glory and gold in the land of the Greeks. These include Franks, Germans, Romanians, Arabs, and a new source from as far north as north goes, the Varangians. They came in long ships from the land of Sweden and settled, or conquered, depending on who you asked at the time, in the land of the Slavs, all the way along the great rivers of Russia. They were tall, rosy-cheeked, and fair-skinned, mostly carrying with them round shields and spears, but also axes, swords, and bows. As Vikings, their intent was to gain riches through the trade of products such as furs, clothing, and slaves. The trade routes were dangerous alone, however, so each time they came back, they did so in larger and more armed groups until it was hard for the Slavs to discern between trading and raiding. These armed groups of Scandinavian merchants called themselves Varangians, a word that would come to mean Norsemen to their soon-to-be Greek neighbors. According to Sigfus Blöndal and the Varangians of Byzantium, the Norsemen would raid one state and trade the spoils with the next. This process would continue as the Varangians secured their trading posts and settled permanently. Blöndal likens this process to that of United States traders in the 18th century, when Americans built fortified trading posts in the American Indian Territory and later settled there. In 862 CE, the Varangians became the ruling class in Novgorod and the surrounding areas, though they would eventually assimilate with the Slavs they ruled over. The people that made up these Varangian-run kingdoms, both Slavic and Scandinavian, came to be known as the Rus. In 882 CE, these kingdoms would be loosely unified under the control of Kiev, where the Rus had recently established their capital. From this new power center, the Rus launched trading expeditions down the Dnieper River into the Black Sea, and from there to Constantinople, or Mikli Karor, as they called it. Constantinople was the largest city in Europe, and as such, a tempting target not just for trading, but for the other Viking pastime of raiding. Throughout the next century, the two states would butt heads, but the Rus navy, though made up of Scandinavian warriors, was no match for disciplined and Greek fire-wielding Byzantine ships, nor were the Rus armies capable of breaching the Theodosian walls. Though marked by failure, the Byzantine emperors took notice of the ferocity of the Northmen. Such ferocity is reflected by 11th century Byzantine monk Michael Psellos, who describes the Varangians as fighting like madmen, as if ablaze with wrath, and with unsparing devotion and complete disregard for wounds. A series of treaties throughout the 9th and 10th centuries established a pathway for Byzantine emperors to call upon Rus soldiers when needed, and for Rus warriors to join the imperial army should they wish to do so. While these series of losses created opportunities for the Byzantine emperors and Rus elites, still Scandinavians at this time, it's worth noting the NATO Slavs paid dearly. One drawn-out affair in the 10th century is especially horrendous. Due to a failed raiding expedition to Constantinople in 944 CE, the Rus leader Igor demanded twice the amount of tribute from his Slavic subjects. He raided the Drevljane twice to enforce his demands, but was killed during the second raid. Leo the Deacon writes the Drevljane who performed the deed tied each of Igor's legs to a separate bow tree, and then released the trees, splitting his body in half. Igor's wife, left to rule in his place, took revenge on the Drevljane by inviting 5,000 of them to a funeral feast in Igor's honor, and having them slaughtered when they were drunk. The Drevljane capital of Iskoristan was then besieged. Olga asked for 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from each household as tribute to end the bloodshed. When the tribute was delivered, the Rus soldiers then set the birds alight and watched them fly back to the city. Those who escaped the inferno were then massacred. Though the last part of this story is likely a fiction, and one that was grandfathered onto Olga, the point remains that she, like those before and after her, kept the Slavs in check through brutality. Where the Slavs saw violent oppressors, Byzantine emperors saw useful soldiers who could fight in their armies, help collect taxes, police their waters from Arab pirates, do any distasteful thing they demand, and guard their persons. By the late 10th century, there was a need for a corps of soldiers who would do whatever the emperor asked, and whose loyalty could not be swayed. Emperor Basil II highlighted this need, as he grew up surrounded by court intrigue that led to the deaths of previous emperors. Blondel brings Basil II's weariness to bear, and the Varangians of Byzantium. At the time of his emergence from the tutelary state to 2 great and able co-emperors, Basil was 20 years old. He had seen one of these father figures murdered in a particularly treacherous and callous manner by the other, and Byzantine rumor, being what it was, had been made more suspicious by the death of the Emperor John in a distant corner of the empire from disease, which produced symptoms only too similar to those of some kinds of poisoning. Furthermore, he had discovered that his mother was involved up to her neck in the murder of Nicephorus. Moreover, such being the political temper of the Greeks, assassination as a means of advancement was only too popular a game. An opportunity to fill this need would arise in 988. Facing a civil war that year, Basil II requested a regiment of soldiers from the Rus, as was his right afforded to him from the many treaties between the two states. Luckily for Basil II, 6,000 Norsemen were sitting idly in Kiev, and the Rus Prince Vladimir was happy to rid himself of them. Vladimir had recently unseated his brother from the throne in Kiev with the help of the 6,000 Norsemen in 980. However, problems had soon thereafter arisen between Vladimir and his mercenaries, who wanted the spoils of conquest. A surviving, though likely exaggerated account tells of the tension. It begins with the Viking warriors demanding what they feel is owed by the Rus prince. "The city is ours. We conquered it, and we want ransom from its inhabitants. 2 grivni for each person." And Vladimir said to them, "Wait a month. By then enough foxskins will have been collected to pay you." So they waited a month, but he gave them nothing. And then the Varangians said to him, "You have cheated us. Now show us the way to Greece." Then he said, "Yes, you go." And he chose out from among them good, wise, and strong men, and gave them cities to rule, while the rest went to Constantinople, to the Greeks. And Vladimir sent messengers ahead of them to bid them to tell the emperor, "See, Varangians are on their way to you. Do not keep them in the city, for they will only give you trouble, as they have given me. But divide them up into many places, and do not let one man come back here again." The 6,000-man regiment Vladimir sent proved their worth after crushing the Byzantine rebellion in 989. From that point on, the Scandinavian mercenaries would serve 2 functions in the Eastern Roman Empire. First, the cream of the crop would replace the executores as the emperor's bodyguards, and would accompany him on all of his campaigns. These particular Varangians, a group of 4,000 to 6,000 strong, under the standard of a dragon, adopted from the executores, were called the Varangians of the city. Second, all others were used for Coast Guard duties in the Navy and as shock troops in the Army. These were known as the Varangians outside of the city. Both groups would accompany Basil II on each of his major campaigns, including his Syrian expedition in 999, in which the Varangians burned down a monastery filled with refugees in the recently captured Emesa. They plundered the monastery so thoroughly that even the copper on the roof was stripped. After another campaign against King Georgi of Georgia in 1021, Basil II had every man, woman, and child in 12 districts killed. which the Varangians did in 3 months. After Basil's death in 1025, the Guard would stay on as a permanent fixture to protect the Macedonian line. New Varangians would have started their imperial service in the navy, as warfare on the water suited them. They would have manned light supporting vessels called osii, which could carry 50 to 60 soldiers and 110 men total. They were fast and maneuverable, mostly used for Coast Guard duty, such as chasing and overtaking pirate ships. The pay was not desirable, but the booty would have been. All the Emperor required was a small fee for each pirate vessel captured. The rest was theirs for the taking. For those Varangians in the army, pay was certainly better. Compared to a regular thematic soldier's yearly pay of at most 18 nomisma per year, a Varangian soldier could expect 10 to 15 nomisma per month. The nomisma, by the way, was a gold coin issued by the late Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire, also known as a solidus. The real cheese was in the bodyguard positions, which would start at 480 nomisma per year. Though desirable, credentials and the fee to enter the Varangians of the city were great. Warriors seeking this regiment would have had to serve for years in the army and save up enough to pay the 16 pounds in gold entry fee. Harald Hardrada, the future king of Norway, would have made his start in the empire in one of the osii, patrolling the Aegean and Sicilian coasts. Exactly where he started his imperial service is a little blurry, but we know he brought with him a host of Varangians from the land of the Rus, where he had spent years in exile after his brother King Olaf II of Norway was dethroned and killed in 1030. Harald served as a soldier under Prince Yaroslav in Kiev, where as a young lad he would have made his bones. By the time he had become a young man, he was a pirate killer in the service of Emperor Michael IV. Having made the trip down the Dnieper River into the Black Sea, he was likely as amazed as his later crusading brethren would be at the endlessness of the suburbs leading into Constantinople, as well as the glimmer of the monstrous buildings within the city walls. Much of Harald's story is one of fantastical chronicles written by Scandinavian sources 200 years after the fact. Yet some of it has been verified by cross-referencing Byzantine, Muslim, and other Christian documents. Not that there is no value in Scandinavian source material. For example, there were some contemporary poems and accounts that survived, but they are few and overshadowed by works like the great Heimskringla and Harald's Saga. The writers of these latter sources would have you believe Harald led his own army of Varangians, pillaging all throughout the Mediterranean, and even conquering Jerusalem 65 years before Christian crusaders would do so in the First Crusade. There is a hint of truth in these statements, as we will see from the story of Harald's imperial service, that being he was assigned to patrol the Mediterranean, and likely had autonomy at times of small bands of Varangians. He also likely traveled to Jerusalem, but only in so much as to escort high-ranking pilgrims. Still, read these sources and tell me they aren't good stories, filled with action, suspense, and gore. With that caveat out of the way, the story I will tell will be one historians Sigmund Blondal and Benedict S. Benedict's painstakingly pieced together. It's not as sexy, and there are a lot of unknowns, but by itself, it's still one hell of a tale. Harald entered imperial service in 1034, and it's likely he was sent to Sicily right away, but not for a major campaign. Instead, he would have been sent there for Coast Guard duties and would return later in his career when the Byzantines took the island under George Maniaces, a notoriously strict Roman general we will touch on later in the story. Scandinavian sources put Harald in the Aegean Sea doing the same thing, so it is likely he was sent all over the Mediterranean as Muslim piracy was a great concern, with orders to give the emperor 100 marks for every captured vessel. Gold was pouring into the emperor's coffers, and Harald's reputation was starting to precede him. He helped crush a rebellion in Asia Minor in 1034, and would have taken part in much of the later campaigning in the east against the Pechenegs and Muslims. By the time the empire set its sights on Sicily in 1038, Harald was already a seasoned warrior and leader. And oh yeah, he was 23. Let that sink in. Enter George Maniaces, or Gierger, as he was called in the Norse sources. He was a winning Byzantine commander whose intimidating size and personality put the most unruly soldiers in line. Sellos attested to his larger-than-life presence in Chronographia. You'll note the Scandinavians were not alone in their flair for exaggeration. I have seen this man myself, and wondered at him, for nature had bestowed on him all the attributes of a man destined to command. He stood 10 feet high, and men who saw him had to look up as if at a hill or the summit of a mountain. There was nothing soft or agreeable about the appearance of Maniaces. As a matter of fact, he was more like a fiery whirlwind, with a voice of thunder and hands strong enough to make walls totter and shake gates of brass. He had the quick movement of a lion, and the scowl on his face was terrible to behold. Everything else about the man was in harmony with these traits, and just about what you would expect. Rumor exaggerated his appearance, and the barbarians to a man lived in dread of him, some because they had seen and marveled, others because they had heard the frightful tales of his prowess. Because of his reputation, Maniaces was chosen to lead an expedition into Sicily to reconquer the island from the Arab chiefs who held it. The first attempt at capturing the island in 1037 had been a failure, but under Maniaces the Byzantines would see a short-lived victory. While Maniaces saw himself a self-made man, he likely saw the opposite in Harald, a man of royal birth who had his opportunities handed to him on a silver platter. One such opportunity was Harald's command over a Varangian unit in Maniaces' army. Being in such close contact, Maniaces got to know Harald's undisciplined nature. On one such occasion, laid out in Heimskringla, Harald was said to have tricked Maniaces into allowing him and his men to sleep on the high ground above the Byzantine camp, which was situated on marshland. Despite the bad blood between them, Harald and his Varangians had a job to do, fighting a number of battles both at sea under the command of a well-liked admiral by the name of Stephen, and on land under the command of Maniaces, who inspired contempt among his junior officers. The fighting, like all medieval warfare, was a grueling and bloody affair. One scene of the Arabs trying to prevent a beachhead landing by the Varangians is described in Heimskringla. The ship was filled with blood by the cape where the blood blew. The ships ran to the shore. The Lord fought nobly. He won sand under him, to the south of Sicily for a great force, where the bodies of the dead let the blood pour onto the planks in the bottom of the ship. Though the island was conquered, one of the Arab warlords managed to escape. Maniaces, the disciplinarian he was, blamed Admiral Stephen, with whom the Varangians would have been more familiar and partial. Maniaces was said to have taken a whip and beaten Admiral Stephen in the head, earning more bad blood by his junior officers, and eventually the emperor himself. Maniaces would eventually find himself in a cell, having lost imperial favor altogether. Harald, meanwhile, was moving up in the world. He and his Varangian unit were called away by the emperor from Sicily in the fighting that had started in Italy by the Normans and the Lombards. He was needed instead in Bulgaria in the summer of 1040, after a runaway slave from Constantinople had raised an army and invaded Greece. Though he would have arrived late in the conflict, Emperor Michael IV recognized him for his service, exploits that were surely circulating Europe at the time. The rumors couldn't have been far off from what the Scandinavian epics would have you believe. In one instance, he was said to have captured a city by collecting birds that nested in the eaves of small houses and coating their wings with wax and lighting them on fire so they would fly back and light the city on fire. Sound familiar? This trope is the same one used in Queen Olga's revenge story, and could have originated as far away as Armenia, where Varangians would have had winter quarters. In another instance, Harald was said to have played dead during a siege. His men requested to be let into the city they were besieging to bury him in the church, but they instead held the gate open while the rest of the Varangians poured in. This tale most likely originated in southern Italy and was about the Norman conqueror Robert Gusgard. Not only was Harald a man of action at this time, but he would have been wealthy and experienced enough to join the Varangians of the city. An honor he was indeed granted, but not for long, as the emperor himself was not long for this world. Michael IV held a triumph on his return from a successful Bulgarian campaign, where it was clear he was dying, likely due to the wear and tear of constant campaigning in later life. Knowing his death was coming, he named his nephew Michael V as his successor and died December 10th, 1041. When Michael V took the throne in 1041, the Macedonians were unpopular with the people, especially his uncles John of Orthanotrophos and Constantine, governor of Thessalonica, who used their offices for personal gain. To combat this perception, he stripped John of his titles and banished him from the capital. He also freed George Maniaces, who had been imprisoned by Michael IV after his confrontation with Admiral Stephen, and sent him to reconquer Italy from the Normans and Sicily once again from the Arabs. Constantine supported Michael V's actions and was therefore spared, but the other men of the family who objected were arrested and castrated. With Maniaces once again free, Harald and his Varangians could not have been pleased. Michael, who had to have been aware of their antagonistic relationship, replaced the Varangians as the emperor's personal bodyguards, with Pecheneг eunuchs, Scuthii, who he had purchased as slaves and trained before his ascent. The real reason behind what happens next is speculative, but for whatever reason, Harald and 2 of his Varangians are imprisoned. The reason handed down through the Scandinavian sources was the withholding of funds from the emperor, likely during the first part of his imperial service as a pirate hunter. There is nothing definitive linking his arrest to Maniaces, but it would have been possible for the general to find such evidence against the former young and undisciplined subordinate, who rose up through the ranks while he rotted in a cell. The 3 men were held in a tower near the church of the Varangians, St. Mary, near the Hagia Sophia. The place was called Harald's Tower for long after. Michael V would only continue to make terrible decisions for his personal safety. Like I previously said, he inherited an unpopular position because of the greed of his family. It is also his lack of inheritance that made him unpopular. By blood, he was not a true Macedonian, as his father was not born to the purple, but rose to it. His stepmother Zoe, on the other hand, was a true-born Macedonian, and therefore seen to many as the dynasty's proper ruler. This was a threat that had to be taken care of. After the new emperor fired his uncle John and reinstated Maniaces, he had the Empress Zoe's head shaved and her person sent to a convent after she allegedly tried to poison him. He found another growing threat in the Patriarch Alexius, a known sympathizer for the Empress. He put Alexius under guard by still loyal Varangians, but the Patriarch was able to bribe his captors and flee to the Hagia Sophia, where he summoned the highest state and military officials. After the announcement of Sophia's deposition, a riot had started in the square of Constantine. The imperial official who made the announcement barely escaped with his life. Alexius and the people aligned themselves behind Empress Sophia, who was still locked up, and placed the palace under siege. The mob, directed by Alexius, attacked the residence of Constantine, but he and his armed guard fought their way to the palace, where he took over the defense. Constantine then sent a boat to fetch Zoe, so he could attempt to put an end to the madness. In the meantime, Alexius and his mob broke into the prisons and freed the prisoners, in a scene not unlike the Nika revolt. It is likely around this time that Harald was set free, as his Varangian brothers too took up arms with the mob. When Empress Zoe returned, she appeared in the hippodrome to calm the crowd, but many did not believe the person before them was her, and the leaders of the mob who really did believe it thought she would be no more than a pawn for Michael. Alexius then called on Theodora, Zoe's sister, to return from the convent where she lived, to be crowned co-empress. She did so reluctantly, and likely under force. Reinforcements eventually arrived at the imperial palace, but it was not enough to break the siege. The main attack occurred April 20th, 1042. More than 3,000 men were said to have died, and the emperor and his uncle fled by boat to the Studite monastery. When the mob broke into the palace, they looted it and burned the tax records, the very same that would have made Harald look bad had he actually withheld money from the emperor. A half stanza from a contemporary Scandinavian poem describes the burning of the palace. The stone-licking flames shot crackling embers out of the soot, and smoke columns rose vertical up from the falling houses. We know how this part of the story ends. Michael and his uncle are discovered at the monastery, and their eyes are gouged out. Maniaces, the stickler for rules that he was, would rebel against the Eastern Roman Empire after the regime change, and would be defeated in spring 1043. His head would be paraded through Constantinople in the following triumph. The Macedonian sisters would co-rule for a short while, until Sophia married Constantine IX, who would deny Harold's request to return home in 1042. In the aftermath of the coup, Harold's nephew Magnus had been recalled to Norway, and had been made king. It is likely Harald thought himself a better candidate, and wanted to rule autonomously instead of as a subordinate under an emperor. He would escape Constantinople in 1043 on one of two ships, in an event that was probably more mundane than the Scandinavian telling. When they came to where the iron chains were strung right across the waterway, Harald ordered that the men should take to the oars on both galleys, and everyone who was not needed for rowing should pick up his bedding and go aft to the stern of the galley. The two boats then slid up on the iron chains, and as they struck and lost their impetus of motion, Harald ordered all men to run forward on the bows. Thereupon Harald's own galley tipped forward and slid off the chains into the water on the other side, while the other struck fast on the chains and broke open, and much gear and many men were lost, while some of the men were picked up in the water. In this way, Harald got out of Constantinople, and so went into the Black Sea. More likely, however, Harald and his Varangians were ordered to a tour of guard duty in a provincial town, and when they were clear of the harbor, turned north. It may even be so that there were chains across the Bosphorus at this time, due to an impending war with the Rus. Harald would eventually succeed his nephew as the king of Norway, and maintain a good relationship with the Byzantine emperors. The Varangian Guard would continue to serve the emperors in the city, in campaigns abroad, and at times against each other when a general with his own contingent of Varangians laid claim to the purple. They would take part in the defense of the empire's territories, as it saw a rapid decline in the late 11th century. The Byzantines would lose Italy in 1071, and the greater part of Anatolia in the decades following the Battle of Manzikert that same year. In the latter disaster, virtually all of Emperor Romanos IV's bodyguards died protecting him. Filling the ranks again was not difficult, however, as an influx in Anglo-Saxon and Danish refugees following the Norman conquest of England provided the empire with many heavily armed and experienced warriors. Perhaps a point can be argued here that Harald was still serving the empire from the grave. Recruitment from the Guard especially increased during the Crusades, as Norsemen passing through would have sought the same kind of glory that was afforded to Harald and other famous Varangians. A verse in the Orkneyinga saga has a Norse crusader during the Second Crusade, encouraging his men to join the Byzantine emperor's service. Let us ride the sea king's steed to Byzantium. Let us not drive the plow through the field. Let us plow the watery bow. Let us receive the emperor's pay. Let us press forward in the clash of weapons. Let us redden the wolf's fangs. Let us do honor to the great king. The Guard would mostly cease to exist, however, after the sack of Constantinople in 1203 and the city's eventual reincorporation into the empire. From then on, they were more ceremonial, though some continued their role as prison guards, nonetheless a far cry from the Varangians of the city. The last reference to Varangians was in the 14th century, when they were part of a 500-man bodyguard unit who protected the 9-year-old Emperor John V. Warriors from Crete would take on the role of the Varangians from this point on, until Constantinople fell in 1453. When I started this podcast, the Varangians were one of the people I wanted to talk about, because who doesn't want to talk about Viking bodyguards wielding two-handed axes? They alone could put the badass in badass stories from Byzantium. But while I marvel at their ferocity, as the 11th century monk Michael Solos did, though removed by thousands of years, I feel very fortunate my country, the United States, doesn't have a Varangian Guard, just as I am thankful my country isn't an authoritarian state like the Byzantine Empire. Where I come from isn't perfect by any stretch of the word, without even touching on current affairs. But I can safely say we have not attempted a genocide within the last 50 years, and we do not allow the mass mutilation and castration of political enemies carried out by foreign agents, which is in its own way a scary thought, considering in some places time is no barrier at all to that way of living. I'm sure some of you out there don't need me, a white man from the Midwest, to tell you that. With any luck, in 1,000 years' time, someone can go through the archives and read an article from the 21st century, and rest assured that the needless violence did stop, and that they can gawk at it, just as we have done through the words of Selos and Snorri. But if history is an indicator of things to come, maybe not.